Brian, just a handful of further questions. The first is about the HAA card. Does it have any implications in terms of accessing liver transplants?
No, no. The short answer is no. Liver transplants are assessed on a clinical need. If a person with haemophilia requires liver transplant, they go on the waiting list in the same way as anybody else. I guess where it does make a difference is we've had quite a number of members who've had to have liver transplants in Ireland. We had a couple of members who had liver transplants in the UK because if they're co-infected with HIV, then they go to a specialist unit in the UK because the numbers in the Republic of Ireland would be so small that the specialist aftercare would be better in one centre. So that the card would provide extra help and support to the individual when they're going over. So, for example, on one or two occasions I've come over to the UK with a member when they were being assessed for a liver transplant, and the card would pay the cost of that visit over.
And then does the HAA card cover the joint operations for haemophiliacs?
No, that's entirely under the haemophilia service.
The home care that you described, what's the source of funding for that? Is that the Department of Health?
Department of Health.
I asked you earlier about how the tribunal approaches the assessment of the cost of care if carers are making a claim, and you indicated you weren't sure of how they approached it. Is there a way we would be able to find that out?
Absolutely. I think if you were to contact Raymond Bradley from Malcolmson Law, he would have dealt with the vast majority of cases of carers, so he would have all the detail.
Thank you. And then in terms of information that's publicly available about the tribunal's approach, does the government publish data about the awards?
The tribunal publishes an annual report, and they publish the total number of cases heard, and then the sort of the total awards, and you can divide one by the other and get the average or mean amount. But it's, in a sense, that's fairly meaningless because you might have a case of somebody who's got Hep C and HIV co-infection and has had serious clinical and social consequences, or somebody who is perhaps hepatitis C antibody positive, was never virus positive. So all the cases are put in together. They don't break it down tranches. So, but they do publish an annual report, and the annual report gives the breakdown of the total number of cases. And I think if you look at the annual report, the last annual report that was published, I think for 2020, I think there were about 3,500 cases heard. The average award, including the reparation payment, was about €250,000, and the average award which had been appealed was about €500,000.
You gave some figures that are quoted in the Archer inquiry report about both the range and average. Are those still accurate, do you know, or has there been a significant change since then?
Can you remind me what figures I quoted for Archer?
I can. I haven't got the report in front of me, but the final report says that you told the Archer inquiry the average payment was it's about €850,000 from a range of between 14,000 and 3.1 million euros.
That range would certainly be correct. It is impossible to know what the average payment was to a person with haemophilia, but it would certainly be higher than the average payment for the tribunal awards generally, because, as I say, they cover an entire range of cases, from primary claimants to secondary claimants to carers. So I would think I think it's reasonable.
And in terms of the tribunal awards, is it right to understand then that the individual awards are not published?
That's correct.
There's no decision from the tribunal.
That's correct.
If they are appealed to the High Court judgments would be publicly available?
Not that I'm aware of, no. Again, I think right through every step of this process, we've taken as much care as possible to ensure confidentiality.
Yes. Understood. Just turning back to the HAA card scheme, the liaison officers, what's the background of the officers?
They would generally be health service employees. They would be, perhaps some of them would have a nursing background, but generally they'd be health service employees. But crucially, when they started in that role, when the card was established, we did some training for them, as did the other organisations. So they came around to the Irish Haemophilia Society, to the Transfusion Positive Group, to the Anti-D Support Group. They heard about the issues, they met the community, so they gained an understanding of the areas that we're going to be dealing with.
And then a much broader question next. Following the publication of the Lindsay Tribunal report, has that had any broader effect in terms of culture change in Ireland, in terms of the approach to treatment and patient safety?
Absolutely. I think when you look at the recommendations from the Lindsay inquiry, which were fairly broad, talking about the need for a committee to look at blood products and the committee and doctors and patients to liaise more closely, I think we put a lot of work before the end of the Lindsay inquiry into recommendations for the future, and a lot of those have come to pass. So you had the establishment of a statutory National Haemophilia Council, which brings together the 4 haemophilia treatment centres, the Irish Haemophilia Society, the Health Service, the Department of Health, and a couple of key experts. And crucially, that council recommends policy to the Minister, but really sets priorities for the year for the whole service, and it's really led to a position where we now have a co-design service where the society are involved in all the major decisions in relation to the implementation of the haemophilia care service in the country. Secondly, we had the establishment on a non-statutory basis of the Haemophilia Product Selection and Monitoring Advisory Board, which carries out the tenders and procurement for the haemophilia treatments, and I think that's now been running since 2002, and in that period of time our availability of treatment has remarkably improved in terms of both quantity and quality. I think we were the first country in the world to switch every patient with haemophilia to extended half-life factor concentrates, one of the first to make the new subcutaneous treatments available across the board to everybody who wanted it, and crucially that's been done in a way where the patient organisation and the doctors are formally involved in the decision. And ironically, despite the fears of the Department of Health when this was agreed, it has actually also turned out to be cost effective. It has saved them a lot of money because we've made it much more competitive and efficient and effective than it had been heretofore.
Just going...
Sorry, just again to expand, I mean, I think the culture has changed. I think everybody realised that this can't be allowed to happen again. So, you know, that there's a co-designed approach to the haemophilia service. Major decisions are taken in consultation with the patient organisation, and especially now as we're entering an era of, you know, therapeutic choices, new therapies, new types of therapies, gene therapy, where you absolutely have to have shared decision making. So I think the culture has been changing, has changed, and I think we'll have to evolve even more in the future.
And do you have any sense of the extent to which that culture change has extended beyond the haemophilia community? For example, the other bodies organisations you mentioned, those involved with the advocating on behalf of those who were infected through transfusion or infected through anti-D, would they, do you know, report a similar shift in terms of culture and patient involvement and shared decision making?
No. Not at all. And in fact, quite sadly, I think the organisation which represented the women infected to anti-D imploded. The transfusion group they really have just concentrated on the issues around the card and on compensation, but they haven't got involved in any sense in terms of policy. But of course, haemophilia is different. If you had a blood transfusion, you had an underlying condition which could be anything. With haemophilia and bleeding disorders, there was a core set of the same treatments, the same ideals that go right through that. So, but I think none of the other organisations have been involved in policy in that sense, although we do have a statutory hepatitis C consultative council, which does include the organisations whose members were affected, and we sit with the Department of Health and we monitor the implementation of the HAA card, and also the council would organise information days every couple of years.
And then just going back to the work of the Compensation Tribunal, do you know what approach is taken to the assessment of compensation if there's a dispute between family members? So there may have been competing claims in terms of care or dependency. Do you know whether that's arisen at all in the tribunal?
I can't really answer that. I think again you could talk to our legal team and they'd be able to clarify that for you. But I know that there have been cases where, you know, several family members have been granted awards for taking care of the person at different points in time.
And then are the awards that are made by the tribunal, are they taken into account for the purposes of any applications for welfare benefits?
No, they're not. They're specifically excluded. And in fact, because of the arrangements we've made with the Revenue Confidential Service, they can't even know about them.
And in relation to taxation, and you've explained the position in your statement, but for the benefit of those who may not have been able to read through your statement, what in short is the position in terms of taxation and the compensation awards?
The compensation awards are tax-free. That's clear. But we also made submissions to revenue that there's a section 189 in the Taxes Consolidation Act which states that if an individual is permanently and totally incapacitated, then the income arising from the award can also be tax exempt or exempt from capital gains tax. And we made a submission which was accepted that in fact every person with haemophilia who got hepatitis C or HIV would fall under section 189. So their awards are tax-free, but also any income or capital gains earned from the awards, from income from the awards, is also tax-free.
And then last question arises from your involvement internationally. You've been involved both in terms of the World Federation and the European Consortium. Do you know to what extent the measures that you've been describing in Ireland, in particular in relation to the insurance scheme and the HAA card, whether those are schemes or measures that have been set up in other countries?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
So those are the questions I'm proposing to ask from those that have been suggested to me by call participants. Do you have any further questions for Brian?
Yes, a couple of areas, if I may. Am I right in thinking that since the early 2000s, personal injury claims, except for those that arise out of medical negligence, alleged medical negligence, have been determined not in the courts as they used to be, but by a compensation or a tribunal, a PIAB, the Personal Injury Assessment Board?
I think that's an option for people who have personal injuries. I think it's an option that they can go to PIAB, but they can also take legal action and go to the court. I'm not fully aware of it, but I think it's an option that they have. They don't have to go to the PIAB.
And when they do go to the PIAB, to what extent does the process there differ, if at all, from the process that you're describing in the compensation tribunal specifically for HCV and HIV?
I have no experience or exposure to the PIAB, so I can't answer that question, Sir Brian, but I would say that the compensation tribunal was much more like a court hearing to assess damages. I'm not sure the PIAB is the same.
Well, it was essentially that I was just trying to get a sense of how similar the process is in terms of compensating those who have suffered infection through the action of the state in respect of their haemophilia treatment or their transfusions, with the process that would be applied in the courts. The next question you may not be able to answer, but I'm given to understand that there may be moves in Ireland, in the Dáil, to introduce legislation which will effectively reduce the amount of money which is paid out in terms of compensation payments for those who succeed in claims. Do you have any awareness of that, or can you enlighten me on that?
No, I think that the vast, in terms of the Hepatitis C Compensation Tribunal, the vast majority of the claims have been dealt with at this point in time. I think the vast proportion of the expenditure has already been spent. I'm not aware of any push by government to limit the amount of funding being made available to the tribunal. If that was the case, we would wholeheartedly oppose that.
It really arises out of your evidence that, in effect, there's no benchmarking of awards in this area. It's all a question of what the tribunal feels is appropriate, subject to appeal.
Yes.
The second area which I wanted to ask you about was just this curiosity, really. You described how the hepatitis C problems were sorted by legislation well before the Lindsay tribunal was established. What was it, do you think, that persuaded government to set up the Lindsay Tribunal?
Well, the Lindsay Tribunal was set up. The government established the Finlay Tribunal in 1997, and that was meant to look at the infection of people with hepatitis C through anti-D, blood transfusion and blood products. Unfortunately, it became apparent to us very, very quickly when the hearing started that they were specifically focusing on anti-D, to some extent on blood transfusion, and they were not focusing on haemophilia issues. Our legal team was not able to get the questions asked that they wanted. They wouldn't accept witnesses. So it became very clear to us that the Finlay Tribunal was purely limited in its scope, and we decided to withdraw from that. And then we had a further 2-year and 3-month period where we spent that time negotiating with the government to establish the Lindsay Tribunal. I think the reason it was established was because, first of all, we kept the pressure up. We kept demanding a new inquiry, which specifically would look at haemophilia. The discussions on the terms of reference took a long, long time. They took longer than the inquiry, the 2 years and 3 months. Having said that, during the course of those discussions, we got government agreement to the provision of recombinant factor concentrates for everybody. We got government agreement to the funding for a new National Haemophilia Treatment Centre. But I think there was a lot of discussion on the terms of reference, which in the end probably worked well because it did define it very, very clearly. But I mean, I think that the government were not keen on having a second inquiry, but we were not keen and we would not accept the first inquiry, where it clearly and patently was not going to deal with our issues.
Thank you. And the other matter is this. You mentioned that the Haemophilia Society of Ireland had made a number of recommendations on the back of the Lindsay Tribunal.
Yes.
And most of those, or some of those, have been put into effect. What are you most disappointed was not put into effect?
I can't think of any recommendation that we made that we regret not being put into effect. There really wasn't. I mean, I think all of our major recommendations have been implemented and accepted.
And which of those do you think has been perhaps the most significant?
The formal role for the patient organisation and the doctors in decision making. Learning from the past where decisions were taken on financial grounds would not be acceptable. So I think the formal role for the Haemophilia Society and the doctors in the choice of treatments on the tender board, the formal establishment of a statutory haemophilia council, which brings together the Ministry of Health, the doctors and the society. And that's actually crucially important, not just in terms of looking at recommendations and priorities, but it means 6 times per year, at least, we sit down with the health ministry, with the doctors, to discuss haemophilia policy. And in fact, the council meets in our office. That's been really important. And I think the funding for the Irish Haemophilia Society was really important. We were funded prior to the Lindsay Tribunal. We got our first funding from the government back in 1989 after the first recompense campaign. And we're now at the point where the Irish Haemophilia Society, about 75% of our funding comes from the government. And that's really allows us to do the work that we do very, very well. It also means, frankly, the government see the advantage of this, because in terms of the procurement process for medications and factor concentrates, we will always insist on having the safest and most efficacious treatments. We carried out a full economic assessment in 2018 of our work on that board since 2002, and we had saved them 175 million euros. And in that point, in that entire period of time, they had given us grants of about 6 million euros. So they gave us grants of 6 million. We saved them 175 million. So I think the government at this point accept that it definitely makes sense as well to continue that.
Thank you very much. I don't know if there are questions which arise out of that.
There are not, but I've had one further issue I've been asked to raise with you, Brian. Do you know whether the Irish government had any discussions with the pharmaceutical industry, pharma companies who had supplied concentrates that had caused infection at any time, in terms of trying to secure a contribution by pharma to the funding of the compensation schemes?
when we started our legal cases back in 1989, 1990, and these were proceeding very, very slowly, then I mentioned earlier that at the end of 1990, we started a political and media campaign to get the Ministry of Health to agree compensation. And you know, again, there was a total lack of response from the government for several months, and culminating at a point when actually an offer was made on the same evening that I was due to appear on a live TV debate with the minister. But one of his rationales for the delay was that they were engaged in negotiations with the US companies to see if they would give a contribution towards any eventual Irish compensation scheme. My understanding is that they were unsuccessful in that attempt. Now, we did assist our members, a number of our members, in taking legal action against some of the US pharma companies, and some of them did receive an award separately.
Thank you. So that's it for my questions. Brian, is there anything that you would wish to add?
Yes. Preparing the statement was a lot of work, but that was easy. I found when I got the Section 9 letter, I found it opened up a lot of issues for me. You know, I found it difficult emotionally, personally. I was seeing names, faces, scenarios, events coming back into my head from the last 20, 30, 40 years. And I think Seamus Heaney said that once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme. And he talks about cures and healing wells. And I hope that by looking at the history, that this inquiry can meet the hope of the community for answers, for acknowledgement, for a sense of restitution, and that, in fact, when the report is published finally, that the report will be seen as a healing well by the community. And thank you for the opportunity to give evidence.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed for the most valuable of evidence. As you'll know, we are spending this week and next largely on the issues which arise consequent upon any findings of fact which I might make, none having yet been finally determined. But you have certainly shone a very bright light on certain areas which might well feature in recommendations. So thank you for that.
So then that's it for today.
Yes, but tomorrow we have a very early start, don't we?
We do. We have a long day tomorrow. So we start at 9 with the evidence of Lord Evans, who is chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life.
Yes.
And I anticipate that his evidence will take an hour or so, maybe hour and a half. And then we have the postponed evidence from the statisticians. So it will be a full and long day.
So full day tomorrow, largely statistics, but also standards in public life, and recommendations which may follow from that plainly. That evidence will go to informing. So thank you once again, and that's it for today.